Ladies and gentlemen, welcome and thank you for joining today's Western EIM Regional Issues Forum. Before we begin, please ensure that you have opened the WebEx participant and chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. Please note all audio connections are currently muted and this conference is being recorded. You are welcome to submit written questions throughout the meeting, which will be addressed at the Q&A session of the meeting. To submit a written question, select all panelists from the drop-down menu in the chat panel, then enter your question in the message box provided and send. To ask a question via WebEx audio, please click the Raise Hand icon on your WebEx screen located above the chat panel on the right to place yourself in the question queue. If you are connected to today's meeting via phone audio, please dial #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue. If you require technical assistance, please send a chat to the event producer. With that, I will turn the conference over to Pam Spoorborg. Pam, please go ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for that introduction. Welcome to our first Regional Issues Forum of 2022. This is another of our virtual events due to the ongoing circumstances in the world. Hopefully we will be returning in person later this year as conditions allow. First, in order to establish quorum, I would kindly ask all of our sector liaisons to please place into chat their attendance, whether they're present. And Emily, if you could help me keep track of those so that we can achieve and recognize quorum. So while that's going on, I do want to announce that we have selected a new leadership team for the Regional Issues Forum. Vijay Satyal has agreed to be the vice chair and will transition shortly into the chair role as he's coming up to speed very quickly. Josh Walter is the co-vice chair from Seattle City Light. He will take on the vice chair role as this transition moves forward. And Ian White from Shell Energy and the IPP sector has graciously offered to be our secretary. So it's great to be here with a whole new group of liaisons and a whole new RIF leadership team. I know that this has been quite the transition, and I appreciate all of our sector members for supporting the election of our new liaison group. And I appreciate the work and the volunteer from our new liaisons. I think we have a lot of exciting opportunities as the RIF grows into our new role with the GRC change. And I think that all of you will be very excited about both our upcoming forum today, as well as all the energy and enthusiasm that these new liaisons are bringing to the forum here today. Emily, have you were you able to keep track? Have we achieved quorum here? I see the California sector, public power, BPA, consumer advocates. Okay, I think we have achieved quorum. And so with that, I will turn over to our first panel on greenhouse gas. Vijay is our liaison coordinating this panel, and I will turn it over to him to introduce our panel members and set up the conversation today.
Thank you, Pam. If we can go back to the last slide, please. Thank you, Emily, or the staff helping. Welcome, everybody. I think under the new I don't want to call mandate, but under the new broader structure that the EIM RIF is allowed to function in, I think as a collective RIF consensus in the last RIF meeting, the RIF members agreed that why don't we take on greenhouse gas accounting as a discussion item. So I'm guilty because it's important to my personal interest, but I feel it's something that we all want to see in the West from a markets expansion perspective. So there was a complete consensus to have a discussion on this item, and I'm very grateful to my RIF member colleagues who helped me bring in guest speakers, and we have a bit of a good presentation here planned. Before we get into providing new ideas or suggestions, it was a very healthy suggestion that we first start with how things work currently. So Abhishek will take over and speak to CalISO and how they currently manage greenhouse gas accounting or the treatment for it. And then we'll have Claire come in and give her thoughts on what she thinks from her perspective, and followed by Mary Winkie in her role from a utility perspective, but also in a new role with PGP. And then I would offer a public interest environmental NGO perspective as well. So just want to give the broad sketches for what we're planning for this, the next, I'm thinking 30 minutes, no, 45 minutes to 1 hour, if I'm correct, Emily and Pam. But Abhishek, please go ahead, if that's okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. Can you hear me? Perfect.
Yes, go ahead.
Perfect. Thank you for the invitation, and good afternoon, everyone. Let me introduce myself. I'm Abhishek Hundiwale. I'm the Senior Advisor in Market Policy and Performance, and I've been working on the GHG policy and its analytics since it went live, and a little bit before that as well. So today I'll just discuss probably setting up the tables for today's discussion, to start with what the current framework for the greenhouse gas accounting within the ISO market is, and a little bit about secondary dispatches after that. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to start with a little bit of background, I just wanted to tell you, so in ISO market, even before EIM, in ISO market, we try to achieve the objective function of optimization by minimizing the cost that are respecting basically the resource characteristics of the resource and the transmission constraints. So for that to happen, generators would have to bid in their fuel cost and the marginal cost of operation into their bids, and we would basically minimize these costs and dispatch the resources. Now with the introduction of cap and trade program in California, we at ISO had to incorporate these GHG compliance costs in their dispatches. So the best way to achieve would be that the generators that are internal to California, they have a GHG compliance cost because they are generating within the California framework. They have a GHG compliance cost, so they would be reflected in their energy bids. Whereas the imports, I mean, to look at the overall aspect of the GHG effects. To serve California load, we have to look into the imports as well. So there are 3 imports that have a GHG compliance cost. So one of them is basically the specified resource. So the specified resource is basically that are responsible for the resource specific emission rate. And when we call it the resource specific emission rate, because these are the known resources, these are the contracted resources, they have these tagged quantities that come through it, and they are responsible for that quantity at the resource specific emission rate. The second type of it what that are responsible was the unspecified resource emission rate. The unspecified resource, they are responsible for the GHG compliance cost at the default emission rate of that is 0.428 metric ton per megawatt hours. And then the third one is basically the asset control supplier, and there are certain areas that have been identified where they have the average emission cost. They're responsible for the GHG compliance cost for their areas average emission rate. So these are the 3 types of, and these 3 are basically what we discuss is that is even before the EIM as well. So that doesn't matter whether it's EIM or not, but this happens in California as well. Now, with the introduction of EIM, we've started optimizing the EIM area with their fuel cost and their marginal cost of operation within their EIM entity, within their EIM BAA, obviously with respecting the transmission constraints and the EIM transfers. Now, whenever they have EIM transfers coming into California, that is whenever because it is a resource specific, they would have these resources that would be deemed delivered into California. And I can get a little bit into detail later on as well. But whenever they are transferring into California, these resources would have the GHG compliance obligation and they would be subject to GHG regulation. However, if the resource is generating and it is consumed outside the area, outside the California, and they're consumed outside into a non-GHG area, then they don't have a GHG compliance obligation. Next slide, please. Thank you. So this is a very simplistic approach that have used a very simple approach, just two resources. Just wanted to see what the effect of that GHG cost is and how they are turned into instruments and turned into card. That is where this is just for that purposes as well. So just an example, we have two resources, one in California and one in EIM. And their energy bid is basically for California, that is internal to California. Their energy bid is $25. And that energy bid already covers their GHG cost because they're internal to California. Whereas at the same time, the resource that is outside California would have an energy bid of 25 because their fuel cost would be at $25 per megawatt hour. At the same time, if that resource is deemed delivered to transfer into California, they would have a GHG bid, and in this case, I've just kept it a very simple of $5 per megawatt hour as their GHG bid. And if this resource is marginal, they would have a shadow price, and that shadow price, we keep that shadow price as a negative amount because we would need to reduce that amount from their energy bid because that is a GHG compliance cost, and we would have to cover that GHG compliance cost for that resource. That is why we subtract that $5 from the energy bid, and that is why the LMP for the EIM area would be at $20 because you subtract that amount, whereas the LMP in the internal to California would be $25. And that is why, so in this scenario, the $5 that is the GHG compliance cost for that resource, the EIM participating resource, is collected from the ISO, from the California load, to be precise, to be California load for that transfers into California. And then the EIM entity collects that $5 and converts it into the compliance instruments and then turns it over to card. So that is how the transaction happens. Obviously, in this scenario, I mean, when you look at it, it's a voluntary pattern. You don't, SC doesn't have to, if they think that they don't want to deliver their energy into California, they obviously can opt out and they can just either put in a zero bid or they can put it as if they don't have to put in a bid in this case. So that is why I just wanted to see a very simplistic approach of how that $5 of GHG bid is accounted and how that transaction happens. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So since we went live with the GHG quantity with the GHG initiative in EIM, there have been several changes that has happened on the GHG side of it. I think when we went live, initially what had happened was we for a GHG cost, I mean, we would have a GHG bid quantity and a GHG price. So this table just gives you an changes that has happened over the years. Initially, we had limited the bid quantity to the Pmax of that participating resource, whereas the bid price we had capped it at $1,000 obviously minus the energy bid. We made some initial enhancements that the Ghg bid price should be less than their daily Ghg max cost. However, in 2018, I think that is when the secondary dispatch discussion started. I'm sorry about that. Yeah, that is when the secondary dispatch discussion started, and we made another change back in 2018 where we limit the Ghg bid quantity to the difference between the upper economic limit and the base schedules. Now that the capping of the upper economic limit, the capping of the bid quantity to the upper economic limit to the base schedules, definitely we've seen that it reduces the potential secondary dispatches. I'll talk about the secondary dispatch in the next slides, but that change that happened in 2018 was basically to reduce the effect of potential secondary dispatches that is happening. Can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. So now this gives you, let's go a little bit into what exactly is the secondary dispatch. So for us, for ISO, the primary we call primary and the secondary. Why secondary? So we think that the primary dispatch is basically the base schedules that are submitted and that are being served to serve the EIM entity load. That is the primary dispatch. And the secondary dispatch is basically what we think is the portion of EIM dispatch that backfills Ghg attributions. So whenever you have a Ghg attribution, if there is a portion of the EIM dispatch that backfills, is that the portion and that digs into the base schedules of it is the secondary dispatch. However, if there is an incremental dispatch above the base schedules, usually you don't have secondary dispatches in that regard. Another point is when we limiting the upper economic limit to the base schedule, the difference between the upper economic limit and the base schedules definitely reduces the potential of secondary dispatches in the market. And I'll explain you a little bit the trend of how it shows in the next slide as well. Now, and we are not saying that it has gone down to zero, we're just saying that the effect of this reduces the secondary dispatch from what it was before to right now. Now, since we have economic potential secondary dispatches, we haven't eliminated it. CARB calculates these emission intensity of outstanding emissions by taking the difference of the unspecified source emission rate and the resource specific emission rate that was attributed through EIM transfers by the optimization, by ISO's optimization. So you take the difference between the unspecified emission rate and the resource specific emission that were attributed through ISO. Now, CARB assigns these outstanding emissions to obviously the UDC's pro rata on the retail load by reducing their freely allocated allowances. So that is how, just a description of what the secondary dispatch is and how they are allocated through the CARB program. Can we go to the next slide?
Abhishek, can I ask you a question, please?
Sure.
For the benefit of the crowd, that some are very deep into the Cal ISO world and some are not. If we go back to the last slide, please, presenter, organizer, thank you. Can you clarify what you mean by the last bullet? Outstanding EIM emissions to electric distribution utilities pro rata on electric load, because there's like three things happening there. I get it, but it'll be helpful for everybody, please.
Yeah, so basically what happens is that whatever the outstanding emissions are, they are distributed to the UDCs. So this is from the CARB program. This does not happen in ISO. It is the CARB assigns them. So they get these allocated allowances, and by reducing, so whenever what happens is that these outstanding emissions are allocated to the UDCs at their share of whatever they had in the ISO market or in the California market. So that is how we allocate, CARB assigns these outstanding emissions. So whatever the allowances that they get, they have been reduced by their pro rata share of how much they would be getting because of these outstanding emissions.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. This is a very simple example to explain what exactly secondary dispatch is, and very simplistic approach. I don't want to get into more detail, but this is a I've used 3 generators over here. When you can see there are 2 hydro and 1 gas. It doesn't matter what it is at that point. To be very simple, I've kept their base schedules at 200 megawatts. Now, when you look at the first generator, their base schedule is, when you look at the graph, right? I mean, the orange part in the graph is the base schedule in that one. The base schedule is at 200 megawatts. Now, when you look at the RTD dispatch, basically RTD dispatch is, in this, the assumption is that they have been dispatched to the upper economic limit in this case. So their RTD dispatch is at 300 megawatts. So that means they have a headroom of 100 megawatts at that point, right? They could go up. And since the calculation of secondary dispatch is after the fact, the assumption in this case is that the Ghg attribution that was deemed delivered into California for this particular resource, we have just assumed that it was 50 megawatts. So in this case, since it was an incremental above the base schedule of that 50 megawatts within that headroom, we don't see any potential, this resource contributing to potential secondary dispatch in this case. Because it was incremental above the base schedule, there was still headroom in that. Now, when we look at the second resource, second generator, that is a gas one, still I've kept it at very simple. The numbers are, the base schedule is still at 200 megawatts in this case. Whereas in this case, the RTD dispatch, it was 250 megawatts. It is still an incremental, I agree. It was 250 megawatts. However, the Ghg attribution that was deemed delivered into California was 80 megawatts. Now, when you see, it is still an incremental of 50 megawatts, but the attribution was more in this case that was deemed delivered. So in this case, for this resource, would be contributing, based on the numbers that we see, would be contributing to about 30 megawatts of potential secondary dispatches in this case. However, for the third one, it's, again, I mean, I've just used as a hydro resource, but it could be anything, it doesn't matter at that point. The base schedule again for the third one is still at 200 megawatts. However, the RTD dispatch for this case goes down to 180. It could be a different reason why it was dispatched down to 180. I mean, the load might be different or anything. So, but the optimization mentioned that the RTD dispatch went down to 180 megawatts. However, the attribution that was the Ghg attribution for this resource got about 50 megawatts. So in this case, since already the Ghg base schedule is below, we would be seeing that this resource contributed to about 50 megawatts of secondary dispatch because of the whole scenario that we are seeing in this case. So this is just a very simplistic approach. I just wanted to break it down of what is the potential secondary dispatch from a different kinds of resources and how they contribute to it. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. So since we looked at how do we calculate the secondary dispatch, this is just a trend of, and this is preliminary analysis that we did. This is just a percentage of transfers serving ISO load that are potentially secondary dispatch. So you can look that we made an enhancement back in November 9, 2018, where we limited the quantity of the bid quantity to the difference between upper economic limit and the base schedule. That effect, when we were saying it reduces the secondary dispatch, is seen in this particular trend, because before the enhancement, the potential of secondary dispatches were around 80 to 90%. I mean, that is just over the whole month, right? Whereas when we say it has reduced, you can see that it has reduced. There is a seasonal pattern to it. What I see, there is a seasonal. There are, for some of the months, there might be the potential secondary dispatch might be about 20 to 30%. However, there might be some months which might be about 40 to 45%. So you can see that there is a trend which is still less than what it was. It has definitely reduced, and you can see a seasonal pattern definitely in the recent past that there are some months which have been down, and it has been in and around 40 to 45% in the recent past. So just wanted to share this trend of how it looks like and what are the potential secondary dispatch, what is the trend, and it has reduced from before and now, and we just analyze this on our end. Can we go to the next slide? Thank you. And this is just the last slide. Just wanted to end with. So on our end, we do track we do have a Ghg tracking that is serving ISO load. So we calculate the Ghg emissions on our end, and we report it out on a monthly basis. How much emissions is to serve Ghg emissions to serve ISO load. You can see from the trend. That the Ghg emissions over the period of years. I mean, from 14 to 15, I removed the 14 year because it was getting a little too crowded, but definitely from over the years from 15 to 21, the Ghg emission has significantly reduced. Obviously, the most important factor, I mean, in this case, there are several factors, but most of the factor would be the renewable penetration that is going through, renewable penetration through RPS. However, EIM is just one of the factors. I'm not saying that is the biggest factor, but EIM, the effect of EIM does have that effect of reducing, but obviously it is not the biggest factor in this. The renewable penetration has that effect of reducing the emission because now you're displacing the emitting resources with the solar and wind, and that is where you see that difference. One important factor now you see in 2021, you see that because of the low hydro year and the drought areas, you see that the emission has increased in 2021 as compared to the other years. I mean, especially from March to June, July, I mean, you see that there was an increase in emission because of the low hydro year this year that we had. And you could see these seasonal patterns. You could see that I mean, it is what it is. I mean, when you have these kinds of years in between, you will see that the emission, because now instead of the hydro, you will have to dispatch the emitting resources, and that would definitely increase the emissions over the period of the years. But there is a seasonal pattern to it. One important thing, just one caveat that I wanted to put in this case is that exports. So in our calculation, when we do our GHG emission tracking, we do take credit for the exports, similar to how when we import the emissions are over here. I mean, that's how we take the credit when the energy is consumed and it is sent out of California. We take the credit for that, which is different than how CARB does their emission calculation. But this is just, I just wanted to put out that we, in our calculation, we do take credit for the export energy that is going out. In our calculation, I think there are three important factors that we look into in calculating the GHG emission. One is the emissions coming from internal resources. The second is the emissions coming out from imports, and the third one is the emissions coming out from the EIM transfers that are being attributed. So these are the three factors that we look into when we do the emission tracking calculation. And that's about it. I just wanted to give you what the framework is, and how a little bit about what the secondary dispatch is, and what the Ghg tracking about it. That's about it from my end.
Thank you. Thank you for doing this. This is very helpful. I think your slides are up on the website already for the RIF, so I appreciate that. If anybody has any questions for Abhishek, please, I think your email address should be accessible. If not, we will make sure you get it. We're going to, in the interest of managing this in an efficient and yet very transparent way, I would like the three presenters, that includes me this time, which is not often the case at all, is that we will speak one by one and then we will take questions at the end. So I want to give Mary Vinke the chance to speak next, Executive Director of Public Generating Pool, with a perspective or a follow-up comment from Claire, and then we'll come to me and we'll wrap up with Claire. So that's just the game plan for this greenhouse gas session. So Mary, on to you. Thank you. for giving time.
Thanks, Jay. Can you hear me okay? Okay. And I am, as you can see, I'm sitting in the Denver airport, so please just let me know if the background noise becomes problematic, and I'll try to speak a little bit louder. As Vijay noted, my name is Mary Winke. I am the Executive Director of Public Generating Pool. Yeah.
Mary, one second. Can we not have this slide presented here because it's not maybe necessarily relevant to Mary's thoughts? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, that'd be better.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thanks, Vijay. I'm the Executive Director of the Public Generating Pool. I have recently transitioned from that role to that role from Pacificor, as many of you know, and I've been working on a lot of these greenhouse gas issues in my prior role, and will continue working on them in my new role. And I kind of want to just talk a little bit about a few concepts, reacting in part to what Abhishek was presenting regarding how greenhouse gas is currently accounted for in the EIM, and then talk a little bit about sort of where we see greenhouse gas accounting or reporting kind of moving forward into the future. And I think one of the things that, you know, a lot of many folks in the EDAM effort and across the West have been talking about is sort of what do we want the market to really accomplish in terms of greenhouse gas accounting or incorporating greenhouse gas costs associated with state policies into the market dispatch. And in thinking through what Abhishek presented, I think there was in conversations around both expanding markets into a day-ahead market or an RTO, and also expanding into a future where more states other than California adopt pricing policies or other types of clean energy policies. We've seen a lot of those policies adopted across the West. In particular, Washington recently adopted a cap and trade program. It's not in effect yet, but will be within the next couple of years. And so, you know, I think the question is really sort of, is the EIM approach, is that solution really scalable and adaptable to both an expanded market and a kind of an expanded policy landscape? And I think there's some really good kind of questions to ask in terms of answering that question. First of all, I think the mechanics of the dispatch become potentially a lot more challenging when you're trying to have multiple states that have pricing policies. And then I also think the sort of what I would characterize as the reporting function or the deeming function that the EIM is currently performing, I think has the potential to create issues down the road as we have more and more states who have a need to have tools in their toolbox to really identify the specific resources that are part of their portfolio, or specific resources that are being imported into their state, or specific resources that are being used to serve load in different jurisdictions. And so I do think that there is a need for a regional solution to really look at that question of, you know, how are we accounting for not just emissions, but renewable attributes, and how are those resource specific energy being allocated to load on what time interval, and kind of across what region. And I think that, you know, the question then I think is how does the market play a role in that, in sort of being the toolbox for that need of accounting for different resource specific energy across jurisdictions in the West. And I think that, you know, there's been some stakeholders who have kind of indicated that the market can be a tool to extract data and extract information. I think that's the case. The market can be a tool to extract information, a lot of detailed data about generation and load. But I think what the market doesn't produce data on inherently is how to figure out what resources are going to what loads, or what resources are going to what states. And I think the CAISO developed this algorithm, this deeming algorithm, as frankly one approach for doing that. But I think you could have different approaches for doing that, or different approaches to identifying which resources go to which loads. There isn't a way to sort of empirically gather data in order to determine that. There has to be some methodology or algorithm or approach applied in order to figure that out. And so I think what's really important is whether the market is really the best tool in which to apply that algorithm, or are there out-of-market solutions or things that we can do after the fact to really do that, those allocations. And I think that part of the reason, too, that this has become an issue, and this is across sort of my role at Supplier and you know, the new role at PGP, where you potentially, if there are different methodologies applied, you potentially have conflicts in terms of where energy is being identified as where it's being delivered. So, for instance, you know, you have concerns in Washington about utilities needing to use certain RECs and energy for their compliance, but then there's the possibility if they allow it to happen for that same energy to be deemed delivered to California. So I think there's, and as I mentioned, there's different ways to sort of skin this cat. So you do have the potential of kind of conflicting approaches or conflicting methodologies. And so I really urge kind of a region-wide conversation about this, and how to really accomplish that reporting function, and questioning whether that the market is the best tool to accomplish that reporting function. What the market does do is, you know, security constrained economic dispatch, you know, and you know, markets are really good at dispatching resources efficiently. And to the extent that the state has put a price on a certain type of resource, then the market should reflect that. And I think it's really important that the markets reflect state policies in that way. And I think that but what I want people to think about is, does that necessarily mean that the market has to report sort of deemed deliveries in this way that the EIM has done? And are there not simpler solutions that we can think about in the context of an expanded market, expanded policies, you know, policies getting ever, you know, percentages of requirements getting ever higher? I think this becomes more and more challenging as these things evolve. So I would just encourage, I think, you know, a lot of dialogue on these issues, and really engaging on, you know, as much as possible, sort of a single solution on creating those tools in order to conduct that accounting on a region basis. I will stop there, Vijay. I've neglected to ask you how much time I had, so I hope I didn't take up too much time or too little.
No, we're doing just fine. We went through 2 presenters, and we're at the halfway mark, 50%. So I should have clarified that the RIF members all work together to pick speakers. We felt we need a CAISO perspective to set the landscape. So Mary, thank you for really raising some good thought-provoking ideas and questions. By the way, for full disclosure, I invited Mary to be on this panel because we wanted the multi-utility state perspective at the time when Mary was in her prior role, and congratulations on a new role. Claire, do you have anything big picture to say before I take over? And then Claire is going to help close out from the Western Power Trading Forum and utilities perspective as well. So I just want to check with Claire, please. But Mary, thank you.
Sure. And can you hear me, Vijay?
So far I can.
Excellent. Yes, I'd love to give just a couple of short comments. I generally, so the Western Power Trading Forum, I think we share a lot of the same perspectives that Mary just laid out from the perspectives of PGP. I guess one thing that I wanted to do is take us back a little bit and ask the question of why we actually care. Why would we actually care about greenhouse gas accounting? And I think there's a couple of reasons. I think one, it critically gets to the effectiveness of state programs in achieving the environmental objective of the respective program. Two, I think my membership clearly has an interest in ensuring that greenhouse gas costs or greenhouse gas benefits for non-emitting power accrue to the appropriate resources. That's both a compliance issue as well as potentially a pricing issue. And then there's the fact that thinking about the need to think about harmonizing accounting perspectives. And I think the reason we care is because when we don't have harmonized greenhouse gas accounting and where we potentially have conflicts between accounting under various approaches, cap and trade versus RPS, clean energy styles, clean energy programs, that creates seams issues, which create inefficiency in the wholesale electricity market and raise costs for everybody. To that end, though, harmonization is ultimately a task for state and provincial policymakers. Markets and tracking systems need to be policy neutral. Ideally, we want those state policymakers to harmonize approaches and avoid setting up conflicts with other state programs so that we can all move towards a clean energy future, but it really is the onus is on those policymakers and those regulators to do that. We can't solve those harmonization issues within the markets or within the tracking system. And just, I guess, one more aside here. Those who have followed the Washington Clean Energy Transformation Act discussions know that these issues are coming out front and center in those discussions. They're carrying over a little bit into the EDAM discussions. I would just note that when programs rely on bundled RECs for RPS or clean energy compliance, that generally aligns with the way that the accounting systems have been designed under the California Cap and Trade Program and the way the Washington Cap and Trade Program is developing its own program. It falls apart only when we start worrying about unbundled RECs. So I don't think that fundamentally, I do not think there is an inherent mismatch of greenhouse gas accounting between cap and trade that regulates imports and the RPS clean energy style programs. I'll stop there for now, and I would like the opportunity to provide some feedback after your presentation, Vijay. Thank you.
Sure, thank you. So let me quickly summarize before we just keep going like a speed train. One of those in France that I got on in 3 hours. I was less than 3 hours. I was from Paris and Lyon, and they meant it. They get done in time and they move you quickly. Mary's big picture comments were: what is the role of the market? What are the mechanics for dispatch? We need to think about attributes. We need to think about methodology and approach. Is markets the best tool, or we need to have out-of-market allocation as well? And the last thing I heard from Mary, big picture, was simplicity and practicality. So that's my thought. And then Claire has brought up the desire or need of Western Power Trading Forum and the community that may agree with that thinking is the need for right resources, harmonizing the carbon perspective. Something that I had not thought about is the seams angle and unexpected costs. And then a very provocative thought is policy neutral design of markets, which is great. Okay, thank you. Can I request the organizer or the slide presenter, please, to move to my slides, please, with WRA. Thank you. So this is some work that we have worked on, my team at Regional Markets in WRA. For those who do not know WRA and are new to me at least, my team of Deborah Kapiloff, Sydney, and I are part of the Regional Markets effort, and we have helped develop a proposal last year, which frankly is a public interest organization's perspective to recognize decarbonization and recognize the need for a larger regional market in the West. We believe a wholesale energy market in the West has multiple benefits, but definitely would create a better and consistent framework for greenhouse gas accounting. Next slide, please. We're going to move through a couple of slides and we'll land on a few slides, but this is a great one. So Cameron Yurkowski, one of the former RIF chairs, gave a good advice this morning, and I really liked it, is share perspectives and not just be an advocate. While WRA is promoting a view of thinking and an approach for greenhouse gas accounting, we will focus just on the perspectives that we bring to the table today. And our perspective is, what are the pathways for a future regional market in the West that can really account for regionality, consistency, practicality of greenhouse gas accounting. So in very awkward ways, we are agreeing with some of the realities that CalISO is dealing with right now, and I think we have some touch points of commonality with Mary and Claire. And the main fundamental goal we're trying to address is what could be the approach to explore and what best practices need to be used. So next slide, please. Our concept, our white paper that is out on the website and we can make available for those who need, is simply dealing with a very open acknowledgement that has come even from CARB in California, that has come from many other perspectives and entities, is we need consistency of accounting. Now you may think about what consistency of accounting means. Tracking means just following the money. Accounting means adjusting and managing it in a consistent way that is a formulaic approach to agree where greenhouse gas emissions is being assigned and to whom and how do you deal with it. So in the business of accounting, WRA has proposed a framework, and in 2022, we're working with Northwest Energy Coalition, Renewable Northwest, and Grid Lab to do some future work on understanding state level issues and needs. If you go to the next slide, please. I'm not going to go through all the slides. This is our main punch points of what we're believing in, why we're interested in regional market expansion. I don't think I need to explain that to this crowd. We are all very familiar with regional market expansion. We all know what the EIM has done. We all are interested in many different ways of exploring or concerned with regional market growth. So I will leave this slide as well and move to the next one, please. So our work, we just had a white paper out, and we're focused on a robust, practical, transparent, and a singular system. We have engaged with multiple stakeholders. We have met with Public Power, we met with Pacificorp, we met with Renewable Energy Buyers Alliance, we've met with the environmental communities. I have visited with consumer cost advocate component communities. And what we're suggesting is nothing new. It's actually been worked before. In fact, Claire has done work in 2008, 9, 10 on attribute-based thinking for generation certificates. So this is not new. We're building on existing work. Many communities, many utilities have explored this idea. But what we're proposing, if we go to the next slide, please, is how can we develop a system that can track greenhouse gas attributes regionally that will not conflict with regional market expansion and dispatch, but will account for multi-utility dispatch and resource attributes. So this will not ignore state RPS laws. This will capture the greenhouse gas attributes that is associated with power being transacted, but can add additionality. And believe me, I worked on the Oregon RPS work back in 2008, 9, and 10 in Oregon. And this is talking about a concept to build on the RECs to create an additionality component that will include all the REC information and build on that and make sure you have an all-generation tracking system. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to go through two more slides, and then we will open up by 3:05 Mountain, which is 2:05 Pacific, because we have to close at 2:15 Pacific. WRA is proposing a load-based, which is tracking generation to the far right, that includes RECs information at the minimum and other GHG emission information that even may not be physically delivered, but you have a lot of combinations of RECs being used, but you also have a lot of combinations of contractual and non-contractual transactions happening. So in other ways, the public interest view, or at least WRA view, I can't speak for other organizations, is developing a way to understand how greenhouse gas will be accounted for across the system, across states. We are very aware of the EIM stakeholder process that is going through these conversations, and I will have a very different presentation, slightly different presentation on February 3rd, thanks to CalISO staff inviting us, where we will speak to why this approach and what are the benefits and what add-on value it can bring on top of RECs and yet not compromise the work of RECs. The challenge we have to keep in mind, though, is RECs are being used in some ways to account for emissions not being generated and what attributes you bring to the table. Who's tracking it? Is there one place for it? Let's not forget, we are in the EIM Regional Issues Forum, but there are other market operators that may come to the table. how do we create a West-wide singular greenhouse gas accounting system that can meet the desires or needs of Mary, that can meet the needs and desires of even CalISO, and also in some ways Claire's perspective. So next slide, please. So what we are recommending is an attribute-based accounting at the core. That would be your fundamental genesis for any kind of accounting. That will basically not just account for physical power being dispatched, but you will account for the generation certificates that includes all attributes that go with it. So you would have power attributes that includes renewable attributes, and they're not renewable, the null power attributes and other things. And I realize I'm getting a bit nerdy here and we need to hold back, but I'm not the complete expert on this, but from everything I've understood and worked with our team, we feel that if we come up with good eligibility criteria for attribute-based accounting, we can help be in a more realistic way of tracking greenhouse gas emissions over time that is not just in the current status quo. So I end with my last slide, please. This is nothing new, and CalISO gets a lot of credit. CalISO staff with the EDAM work group is going to be giving a bit of a high overview, I think in a week or two, I think in the next week, to speak to generation certificates and what's being done. Many folks on this call are very familiar with the New York Gas accounting system and others, but we take that as an example. This is our prototype. This is not our benchmark. This is not our please use this and we're done. This is our basis for starting the conversation. You already have REC information in there. You can have a lot of information accounted for, but you have the additionality brought in. So you have a consistent one instrument that has multiple sets of information added into it. So in other words, WRA proposes, and for public interest groups also, is we do not create multiple streams of accounting. We create one instrument, but has multiple layers in it, but you bring in all the RECs information, you bring in everything else that is not otherwise accounted for. And if, to Mary's point, which is a very good one, in my opinion, you could have a pre-dispatch generation certificate. So there is a role of the market. Then you have a post-dispatch verification that's out of the market settlement. This is exactly what banks do. Banks create transactions and they create loans. They make a projection of how many loans they'll give out at the beginning of the year. At the end of the transactions with the banks and interactions with markets, they look back at the settlements and they work it out of market. So I'm not trying to simplify this to trivialize it. I just feel that we can have a role for the market using all generation certificate. So you are accounting for all the appropriate clean energy requirements of clean energy required states that is coexisting with carbon pricing needs of carbon pricing states, and yet you have a post-market settlement where the generation certificates are verified for any out-of-market adjustments that take place. So sounds crazy, sounds maybe not clear, but I feel that we could explore this instrument both ways, in through market or out of market, but we do feel a consistency of instrument and consistency of accountability in a platform is going to be fundamental. To that end, next slide, please. So we end with this. Our best practices for whatever is developed for greenhouse gas accounting includes these practices. If you can include these fundamental practices in whatever market design you include, whether it's the EDAM, because we're allowed to talk to the EDAM and engage on that process, or it's something else, or a third market operator that comes into play. These 4 or 5 items are necessary for a good greenhouse gas accounting in the West. And believe me when I say this, the public interest community is equally concerned for what is the cost to consumers, what is the cost to third-party external participants of energy, what is the cost to transmission operators who have to verify for the energy being transferred on their system. Is that we want consistency of information. We want a one-stop greenhouse gas collection verification process. And we also want to make sure that carbon pricing, where possible, is aligned. And yes, when an unspecified power transaction taking place, you come up with some emission rate calculations that would attribute the right appropriate attribute. You would allocate the right environmental attributes for it. So I realize I speak fast, and I wish I never did. But we have a lot more slides here, but they're all on the website. You can look through more, but we will pause here, and There's an email address for us at WRA. If you have ideas or questions, please. We love to explore and learn more. But just want to end by saying we are embarking on a 10, 11 states tour to meet and interview Western state environmental decision makers, DEQ environmental policy planners, and regulators, and get their thoughts on what their needs are, what their issues are, not just what this is. So in future, if anybody's interested, we'll be bringing that back to the table in the summer. But thank you, and that's me. And coming back to my new role, being the host for this workshop, I invite questions, and organizer / facilitator, thank you. We can go back to the main EIM riff screen, please. And let's take questions from anybody and everybody that focuses on the presenters today and not the stakeholder initiative that is concurrently in play, please. Thank you.
And Vijay, did you have a response here?
Actually, yeah, before we get to you, Claire, I do want to recognize Kathleen Colbert for inviting Claire to be the presenter here. So yes, Claire, you are absolutely the last responder. You have about 3-4 minutes, and then we'll open it up for the last 10 minutes to everybody. Thank you.
Okay, so I should speak now.
Yes, please.
Okay.
The floor is yours for 3-4 minutes. Yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to give it a little bit more of a reaction to your presentation, Vijay, and thank you for the time on this. So I guess I would start with, I have absolutely no objection to the idea of an all-generation attribute tracking system. The objections I have.
That's great. Can I get that in writing? Because then I'm going to use it everywhere and use it in testimony.
But I don't think it solves a number of our problems. That's where I would have a niggle, is I don't think it necessarily solves the problem. So you know, what an all generation attribute tracking system would do is it would allow other non-RPS eligible resources to basically get a REC-like certificate for their generation that would have an emission rate associated with it. Regis already has the capability to do that. It just needs to be turned on, and it will require state policymakers to require that Regis turns it on and would let, for instance, gas generation or legacy hydro, which we're looking at in Washington and the CETA, to be registered and issue certificates. Where I think it fails is that an all-generation attribute tracking system doesn't get you to accurate load-based accounting, and it seems to me that's the direction you're going. You're trying to get accurate emission accounting in terms of the utilities' use of resources to serve load. You won't get there unless utilities are effectively required to have generation attributes for all their purchase power. So not just the clean power, but to also have certificates for any gas resources. States could certainly do that, but they should also recognize that utilities will have to pay for that because there's a cost to registering a resource in Regis, and if utility is requiring a counterparty to do that, they'll have to pay for it. So there's a cost there. It's also not clear to me it would help with undifferentiated power in the market, like the exchange traded power that is just sold as firm unscheduled, and it could potentially prevent those sort of transactions because that sort of power is not specific to a particular resource when the transaction is entered into. And then I would also say that it is also potentially, depending on how it was set up for rules for accounting, prone to the same sort of problems as unbundled RECs if you were allowing unbundled certificates. The other part I wanted to respond to is the idea that the market operator, in this context, the CAISO, would need to have a role. Again, I don't really see that as a necessity because of the fact that the market operator will already have eyes on all resources. It'll know the technology, it will know the emission rate of those resources. A market operator will also know in real time the dispatch and thus the emissions of those resources, whereas if it's a generation attribute tracking system that's modeled the way the current tracking systems work, those are monthly vintages. It's not going to be hourly vintages. So it wouldn't address so the market operator would have better real-time information on emissions from its own system. So I don't see a role for market operator in doing this, because I don't see that there's additional value added of pulling that data into the market. There may be a role as states go forward to think about using all generation tracking outside the market as a more administratively simple way of tracking emissions to utility portfolios, rather than having to effectively unbundle utility contracts and procurement contracts. So I'll stop there and let others jump in.
Claire, that was a lot. Thank you. I tried to keep up. I think I requested and for those transparency's sake, I requested the event producer, and I'm glad we had this recorded, because you've offered a lot of thoughts and rebuttals. So I don't want to get into a response to response. Let's open it up for everybody. We have about 8 minutes or 9. So if others have big picture questions for everybody else, or the other presenters, please go ahead. Anybody? And I'm going to look to our event planner to help us track as well. But I didn't do a good job tracking whose hands went first, but I see Will and Kathleen, please.
Yep, William, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, Vijay. My question is about your best practices for greenhouse accounting, and you're talking about using the best available data to assign environmental attributes to unspecified power. Can you expand on that and explain what you're suggesting there? I did read your white paper. I'm just trying to hear what you're.
Oh, great. And you're going to fact check me. That's scary. I think what Deborah, our greenhouse gas expert, helped me with was assigning a thermal emissions rate for unspecified power, and there's an eGrid thermal emissions unspecified rate that we could use for that. So that's my one part of the answer to you, but I'll have to look back and get you on that. But that was our understanding, is use the unspecified EPA assigned emissions rate for thermal emissions at least, and assign it appropriately as best.
Great, thanks, Vijay.
All right. Did you want to identify Will's affiliation? Or?
Yes, thank you. Will was with Oregon Cub. I think I'm pretty sure of that.
Sorry, I should have said that. This is William Ghg with Oregon Cub.
All right, perfect. We're moving on to the next caller, which is Kathleen. Kathleen, go ahead.
Great, thank you. This is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Very, very interesting panel. Thanks everyone for doing such a fabulous job. I had kind of a big picture question I wanted to see if panelists could share some of their thoughts on. You know, I think, and Abhishek alluded to, that there's an aspect of what the EIM is doing that is looking towards minimizing the amount of emissions that the solution produces, versus a lot of what I hear, you know, Mary mentioned, and then Vijay and Claire as well, talking about really the tracking and the accounting after the fact. So I wanted to see if we could kind of separate those two ideas, minimizing, so a least cost security constrained dispatch that also has a goal to minimize emissions, plus tracking and accounting. Do you see them as equally as important? Do you see it as one is more important than the other in the Western markets? And I just was curious about hearing kind of juxtaposing those two pieces and hearing panelists' thoughts on that.
Kathleen, thank you. Let's go with Abhishek first, if you wish, if you feel comfortable, because that's a policy question. I leave that to you, but then Mary, and then Claire, and then I will go in the end, please.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. So in that regard, from a policy perspective, the ISO's, as a market operator, the ISO job is to minimize the cost at the same to be fair enough, right? I mean, we would have these Ghg accounting in our we would have these Ghg accounting that happens. It is more of an accounting mechanism, but I think at the end of the day, when we look at from an operator perspective, we would have to minimize the cost from the merit order perspective. So from that perspective, I would say that, I mean, I don't have to take any sides on it, but the optimization would have to decide what the uh, what what the merit order is and how do you minimize those costs.
Thanks. Mary, any thoughts? Does it matter which is important or both are good?
Yeah. I mean, I think they're equally important, but again, I think it's good to think about what is important for the market to function as it should. And I think, I think Claire mentioned this, and I think this is very much so the case, that the market should be pricing resources accordingly, that the resources that have emissions that are priced under state policy should be dispatched associated with those emissions, and that clean resources are also have the ability to get that benefit in the market as well. So I think that's very important. I think the reporting is equally a key aspect to compliance with policies across the region. From my perspective, though, the reporting is not a market function per se. Maybe it could be, but I think there are lots of different ways. As Vijay, has one proposal, I think there's lots of different ways to think about how to do the reporting. I don't necessarily think that that's a natural function of the market.
Thank you. And I will kind of go in agreement with Mary, but in a slightly different way. If you really want to capture the cost of resources that reflect their extraction, the transportation, and the ultimate optimization, in Abhishek's job as a market optimizer, he just needs the right reflection of the resource cost to put in the stack. So if there is optimization that can take place that reflects externalities, we do need a role for carbon pricing or clean energy to be reflected through the optimization, but there's an equal and appropriate fiduciary duty for the reporting to be done fairly once the optimization is done and completed. So whether the whether the reporting transactions can be managed by a market operator or not, does get to a transaction administrative matter. If the market operator can take it on and do that second part, great. If not, we have systems in place. We have Regis right now. Should we be exploring an expansion of that role or other platforms? I'm not asking for Regis to be abandoned one bit at all. In fact, I was proud of Regis to be built and develop a common regional solution. So to Claire's point, if states need to have a conversation with the utilities to have a consistency of accounting, then we need to explore that conversation. But I do feel you cannot put one over the other. They're both important, and optimization for carbon and clean energy goals is feasible. The math is available. It's just a matter of agreeing on the market design rules.
Can I just offer a quick comment?
We have 2 more minutes literally left. I'm trying to be a bit of a time Nazi. No, but Claire, please, yeah. Sorry, I generally agree. You made one point about pricing and externality. I think that's when a market can optimize. It's nobody's figured out a way for a market to price a benefit. If it can't be priced, the market can't optimize for it. I do agree with you, Vijay, that there is an important reporting role. The ISO already does that to the California Air Resources Board for the deeming. I anticipate it will continue to do that in some way. And I also think there's a need to rethink whether there are ways to improve the emissions data that comes out of the market in terms of the footprint, both for stakeholders and potentially other regulators. I'll stop there. Okay, we'll take one more question. Event organizer, can you please help us with that? And then we'll close this session for today, please.
Very well. Rob, your line is open. You may go ahead.
Great. This is a question for Vijay. And it's really around to what extent are these proposals complementary to existing state policy, or do they require a rewrite in all these different jurisdictions? Have you sorted out how they could fit within them, or are we kind of reworking the whole accounting for the West?
Your question should be broken up into two parts. What would you like versus what is feasible? And in terms of what is feasible, I think the proposal can accommodate and not conflict. But ideally, some states may want to consider from the grounds up, thinking how their state policy should be designed to work with a regional framework, because the regionalization of electrons flow, carbon and non-carbon resources is inevitable. So in 4 states, at least, our internal research of all the state laws has shown that such a framework will not create a challenge as long as there's good reporting that can be used at the state level to do the mathematical adjustments for state level accounting. So if market design is done well in EDAM or other regional market frameworks, or I'm being honest, other market operators come to play, how you adjust for it, how you account for the null power issues, how you adjust for non-RTS eligible rec issues that Claire brought up. I haven't figured out the deep science there. I don't think it's an untenable situation we would be in. It's really a matter of how state compliance processes can be flexible and get good access to a consistent one-stop shop information. If we can agree on a one-stop shop platform to hold everything, it can all be feasible. I'm not trying to paint a blue sky so easily.
Great. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Claire, Mary, and Abhishek for literally coming on to this session literally on the fly in 3 weeks. And we had to kind of quick organizing call last week. So thank you all for this, and to the RIF members who supported this workshop discussion for 1 hour. I give it back to you, Pam. Thank you.
Thank you, Vijay, and thank you again to our panelists. That was an excellent overview of greenhouse gas policy and operations, and I think really helpful and valuable for us going forward. Our next presentation is from the CAISO, from Radha Madrigal, who is on the training team for CAISO. And we will be talking about the CAISO market runs that support the day-ahead market. Emily, can you advance the slides? There we go. Thank you. And one of the reasons I want to set a little bit of the groundwork for this presentation is that, I think a lot of times when we talk about market design in a stakeholder initiative, we talk about the market as one thing. But the reality is that the market processes are broken into a series of market runs that have different functionality. And I think that by going through what each market run does and its purpose and how they're interrelated, I hope that will help stakeholders understand a little bit of the underpinnings of the market so that we can have a more robust conversation around what we incorporate into each run or what we're asking each run to do from a market purpose perspective. And with that, I'll turn it over to Radha and to have her walk through this presentation.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me, Pam?
Yes.
All right, and I'm starting video as well, so I think you should also be able to see me.
I can see you. Excellent.
Okay, great. All right. Thank you for inviting me here today. Folks, everyone, my name is Radha Madrigal, and I'm one of the lead client trainers here at the California ISO. I see a number of familiar names there in the attendee list, so I've interacted with some of you on calls before or worked with you together when we used to work at the ISO, so nice to see your names. Again, as Pam indicated, I was essentially invited here today to talk about the market processes, and we're going to go into that today. First, we'll talk about the day-ahead market processes, and then we'll talk about real-time. I recognize that I have about an hour, and I have prepared 50 slides. I know that's too many slides for an hour, but my goal here was we decided when we were kind of debriefing this or preparing for this is that we would focus on the day ahead market and make sure that those of you who are attending the call today get all your questions answered about the three processes in the day ahead market. And we would focus our time there. And then if we had time, we would move to discussing the real-time market. In anticipation of that, I do have slides prepared about the real time. If we don't get to that point, we can possibly revisit this at another time, but that's essentially how today is going to be structured. These slides are posted now where you can get on the Western EIM page where you can get your RIF material. So with that, I will dive right into the day ahead. And like I said, we'll talk about this first, and then if we have time, we'll get to real time. There's three processes in the day ahead market, and I'm going to stop after each one to give you an opportunity to ask questions to make sure that you understand how each one of those works. At a high level, this slide here is going to be the universe, if you will, of everything that we talk about today. So the day ahead market opens 7 days before the trade date, and then it closes at 10 a.m. the day before. Then we have a series of processes that run. We're going to take you through those processes now. And then the market closes at about 1300 the day before. So we're going to dive right into each one of those processes. First of all, just to level set, the point of having a day ahead market is to essentially make sure that we are prepared a day in advance, that we have all of the resources lined up, and ensuring that they will be deliverable in real time. So the goal is to be ready for the coming day. There's a lot of data that we use in the running of the market. The market engine consumes a lot of information, data about the transmission system, the various resources connected to that system, any outage information, whether that be on the generation side or the transmission side. We have bids from market participants. We have forecast of demand that gets factored into one of the processes, and of course information about our transmission system and the limitations of those lines or what we have to operate within those limits. So that's some of the data that we consume or the market consumes. There also are a series of requirements that we are meeting. We are making sure that we carry enough reserves, that we meet certain targets, and that we make sure that we line up enough energy to serve demand. So we pull in a lot of information into the day ahead market, and what comes out of it are energy and capacity schedules and also settlement information. So that's kind of a high level big picture of what's happening and what's going into it. The focus really of today's sessions is going to be talking through each one of those day ahead market processes to get you familiar with how they work. As I said before, market closes at 10 a.m. the day before, and then we have three processes that run. We have both, all three of them listed on the slide here, and we're going to talk you through each one of those sequentially. So the first thing that we do is we run what's called the market power mitigation run. After that is completed, we have the integrated forward market, and then we have finally the residual unit commitment process. Once all of that is complete, we publish market results at about 1300 the day before, and that's what triggers the opening of the real-time market. So first, we'll talk about the first process in day ahead, which is called market power mitigation. Now, the goal of market power mitigation is essentially to make sure that resources that have the potential for market power are not exercising that. If you think about this in the concept of these resources, there may be what we call pivotal suppliers. Those are resources that if we are running the market, we may not be able to clear or solve the market without their capacity, without the capacity of that pivotal participant. And in this case, technically, they could bid whatever they wanted to and sell at least part of their output. We may have an overall supply that is sufficient, but if there's a limited number of suppliers, they may be able to control essentially the prices in those locations. So the market power mitigation process was designed to mitigate this effect of these pivotal suppliers. So there are a series of runs or tests that we do during market power mitigation And by we, I mean the market software or the market engine. So there's a couple of tests that the market engine runs. One of them is called the Residual Supply Index. You'll also hear reference to a dynamic competitive path assessment. Essentially, at a high level, what we're doing is first we do a pricing run. It's not financially binding, but essentially it establishes which constraints are going to be tested. And then our mitigation engine runs a series of tests on those constraints and resources, essentially checking to say, if I remove the capacity from these pivotal suppliers, can I still clear the market in this location? And if not, then what we're saying is those pivotal suppliers have the potential to exercise market power. It doesn't mean that they're actually doing it, but they have the potential to exercise market power. So in this market power mitigation run, we're not doing any scheduling or dispatching. We're just essentially analyzing the bids to make sure that they're competitive. If we determine that folks may have the potential for market power, those bids are then analyzed, and we may mitigate or lower those bids that they've submitted to bids based on what we call predetermined calculations. And on this next slide here, I'll go into a little bit of that. So if we determine that these suppliers have the potential for market power, then we will lower or mitigate their bid to the higher of either their default energy bid or the competitive LMP that was determined in that pricing run that we referred to earlier. This default energy bid is a calculation or a determination that is used, and there are a series of ways or methodologies, I should say, to calculate those bids. I've listed them on the slide here by name. I won't go into the mechanics or the calculations of each one of those, but I've given you the tariff citation if you're curious and want to dig into that a little further. There's also in one of our business practice manuals, the BPM for market instruments, there's an attachment D that covers the calculation of these default energy bids. So essentially what we're saying is a resource when they're setting up and preparing to join the ISO market and providing all of their data to us about that resource, they choose the calculation methodology that they want to use for that resource for its default energy bid, which is the bid that their economic bid would be replaced with if they're determined to have this market power. So there's a variety of calculations or methodologies that are used to come up with this number, but essentially what we're doing at a high level is we're analyzing the bids that were submitted. If we determine that somebody has the potential for market power, we'll take a look at the bid that they've submitted, and we may lower it to either this default energy bid number or the competitive LMP that had been determined in that pricing run. So that is the first step of the day-ahead market. And I wanted to pause here to see if you had any questions about how that works.
All right. Currently, I do not see any questions in queue.
Okay. Just wanted to bring up the chat panel in case folks want to put a note in the chat. So while I am talking, if you have any thoughts that you maybe want me to address, but don't necessarily want to ask a verbal question, you can also put a note in the chat pod there, and I will take a look at that periodically. So that was step one, market power mitigation. Step two is what we call the integrated forward market. So the bids that come out of the first process of market power mitigation are called the clean bid set or a clean pool of bids. The next step in the day-ahead market is called the integrated forward market. And here we take those bids that were submitted, now both from suppliers and folks on the demand side as well. In the integrated forward market, we're clearing bid-in supply against bid-in demand. And I've underlined it here to emphasize that we haven't looked yet at the demand forecast in this particular process. So because we are clearing bid-in supply against bid-in demand, it is possible that we may not procure sufficient capacity in this run to cover the forecasted demand that we have. And I've got a little note here on this slide that we'll talk about that forecasted demand when we get to the third process of the day-ahead market, which is residual unit commitment, which is where we address that forecast. So here in the second process, we're taking a look at the demand bids and the supply bids, and we are clearing those against each other. What comes out of that process are day-ahead schedules and also virtual awards for folks that are financially participating as convergence bidders. As we are clearing bid and supply against bid and demand, we're also doing procurement of ancillary services, and I've got a slide coming up that'll identify what each of those are, but we're procuring 100% of those reserves in the day-ahead time frame, and that's producing ancillary services awards as a result of this market process. The third square there says commit resources. So when the ISO determines which resources we are going to turn on or have running in the coming day, that is an ISO commitment of resources. So that's what's happening in this particular process. This next slide here illustrates what clears in the integrated forward market. So I have all of the supply bids organized along the supply curve. All of the demand bids are lined up on the demand curve. Where those 2 points cross determines the total cleared demand for each particular hour in the day ahead market. So we're doing this market clearing of the 24 hours of the day ahead. So there will be 24 different intervals in the day ahead, and this is how we clear each of those intervals. You can see that we have, I have a mention about self-schedules. So folks are either participating economically by submitting a bid for megawatts with a price associated with that, or they are a price taker or a self-schedule, meaning they're scheduling megawatts without any price associated with that. You'll see that both on the demand side and on the supply side. And as demonstrated on this slide, you'll also see that we have more demand self-schedules than we do supply self-schedules. So those are put at the beginning of the economic curve. Where those 2 points cross, the supply bid curve and the demand bid curve, that determines the total cleared demand for that particular hour, and that will set the market clearing price for energy for that particular hour. There was a question in the chat that asked about what is a demand bid? Are they added to the forecast to match supply? So a demand bid is a bid from load serving entities, essentially wanting to secure a certain amount of megawatts in the day ahead market to serve the demand that they will be serving in real time the coming day. So suppliers bid in their energy to provide energy to the grid, and load serving entities are bidding in their demand. And they will do that in order to clear a certain amount or a certain percentage of that demand in the day ahead at a price that is that's workable for them. So in day ahead, we're clearing supply against demand. In real time, we're clearing supply against the ISO forecast. So it's done a little bit differently in the real time as compared to day ahead. I mentioned the concept of commitment. The way you submit the bid to the market determines your commitment status. If you are a self-schedule, on the supply side, you're saying I'm going to be running and I'm going to be providing, let's say, 100 megawatts, and I will take whatever the market clearing price is for that. In that case, you are essentially the resource owner is determining, or I should say the scheduling coordinator for that resource is determining that they are going to be running the resource. So the scheduling coordinator is committing that resource. That means that they're not eligible for something called bid cost recovery, which is a market mechanism that we have designed to make whole those resources that have received ISO market awards and may not have earned enough revenue across the entire operating day to cover their operating costs. So at the bottom of this slide here, it talks about ISO committed. And what we're saying here is if you have submitted an economic bid to the market and the market has provided you with a day-ahead award, that is a commitment, or the ISO market engine has selected your resource, and therefore that makes you eligible for this concept called bid cost recovery, which analyzes all of your market awards and the amount of energy that you dispatched on a particular trade date, and looks to see if you've earned enough revenue on that trade date to cover your operating costs. And if not, there's something called a bid cost recovery uplift payment that is provided to that scheduling coordinator in order to make them whole. There's a lot of nuance around that, but that is a market mechanism that we have. And the point of this slide is to indicate that if you're self-scheduling or if you're a price taker, you're not eligible for that bid cost recovery. There's also the ability to do both, meaning you can self-schedule a certain amount of your resource and then provide economic bids layered on top of that. If you do that, then you may be eligible to recover the energy bid amount through this bid cost recovery process, but not the startup or minimum load element. So I think, oh, that was just something else. That was just saying thank you in the chat. Okay. So the next slide here talks again about we're still in the integrated forward market. We're still clearing bid and supply against bid and demand. We also procure ancillary services, as I mentioned, in the day ahead market. So that makes sure we make sure to procure a certain amount of reserves in order to have excess capacity available in the real-time market. It falls into two different categories. The first is regulation. And these resources are connected to the ISO energy management system through a functionality or a mechanism called automatic generation control. We have the ability to, or the market has the ability to adjust the output of these resources every 4 seconds. There's two different products. There's regulation up, so providing more energy to the grid, and regulation down, so removing energy from the grid. This service is something that a resource must be certified in order to provide. So you need to become certified to provide ancillary services. There's some testing involved, and then you have the ability to bid into this market product in addition to bidding for energy. In addition to this regulation ancillary service or a capacity product, we also have something called contingency reserves. That falls into two different categories. First, there is spinning reserves and then non-spinning reserves. And I'll say that this terminology is probably a little bit more legacy terminology because not every technology today actually has a turbine that is spinning, but the concept of either being synchronized now to the grid, which would be spinning reserves, and able to provide my energy within 10 minutes, or if I'm non-spinning, it means I'm not synchronized, but within 10 minutes, I have the ability to synchronize, be running at the same frequency, and be able to provide energy within 10 minutes. So these are 4 different ancillary services products that you have the ability to bid into if you are certified for them. We procure 100% of these capacity products in the day-ahead time frame, so you would receive market awards for these. And as a side note, as a kind of wrap-up at the end of the day-ahead process explanation, I have a little bit of an example that brings it together from the perspective of a supplier who would be offering both energy and ancillary services to the grid to kind of give you allow for a discussion from the perspective of a participant. So we're going to talk through a couple of these processes, and then at the end we'll close with an example kind of saying, so now what does that mean to a supplier? So stay tuned for that. When we are procuring these ancillary services, we do it on a regional basis. Now this slide here, remember that the day ahead market right now is just for the CAISO footprint. So we've got the state of California here, and I'm going to be showing you how we procure ancillary services for this area. Obviously, we're talking to a regional audience, and if this is something that gets opened up to a larger footprint, we would be clearing this type of thing if it's designed this way across a larger footprint based on additional areas. But just for illustration, this is how we're doing it right now. We have the California ISO footprint, which we call the ISO system region. And then I've got a couple of little lines that we add to the picture here that are intended to indicate interties. So being able to bring in additional power across the ties. So when we analyze for procuring ancillary services, we're always analyzing the full system region plus expanded region, meaning anything we can bring in over the ties. And then we also slice up the state into a couple of different sections. We've got some major transmission corridors in the middle of the state, Path 15 and Path 26. And so we look to see procurement of ancillary services north of Path 15 and north of Path 26, and then in the southern direction as well. Again, looking at those areas plus anything we can bring in over the interties. So the concept here is that we procure ancillary services on a regional basis with also some potential for local capacity needs as well. As we are procuring these ancillary services, we are meeting specific targets. So we have set, the ISO has set procurement targets based on WEC standards, and we're using those standards to determine how many reserves we need to carry and procure. We're doing all of that in the day-ahead market time frame, both for the regulation up and down, for spinning and non-spinning. And then the last bullet here refers to residual unit commitment, which is actually the third process of the day-ahead market that we'll take a look at in a moment. All right, as we're talking about the concept or the word commitment or selecting which resources we are going to turn on and run, I wanted to point out kind of a little bit of how that engine works. The engine is called Security Constrained Unit Commitment, and it's essentially a series of calculations that are designed to commit or select which resources the market will be running. And the goal of this complex calculation is essentially to figure out the best way to do this at the lowest price, respecting transmission constraints. So that's the security part of the word here. It's not always possible to get all of the energy from every cheap resource out there because we have to respect the transmission limitations or contracted use of the lines that has already been used up, or a variety of situations like that. So the security constrained unit commitment, or we'll call it the SCUC engine, minimizes both the startup and minimum load cost of the resources that it is selecting, along with the bid-in energy cost, and also costs associated with providing those ancillary services, given specific network or transmission constraints. We're also doing this across the entire time horizon in the day-ahead market. In the day-ahead market, we're running and optimizing across a full 24 hours. So the best way to use the resources that have bid in across that full entire 24-hour time horizon. So we're not optimizing each individual hour separately, but we are looking at the full 24 hours and figuring out the best way to use the resource mix across that full 24-hour time frame. This methodology or this engine maximizes economics and essentially makes sure that as we're selecting resources, we are relieving network congestion and respecting any of those physical constraints that need to be worked around. And the goal is to do all of this at least cost. So that is the wrap up of the second process of the integrated forward market. And so I'll stop here to see if you have any questions about IFM before we move to the last process of day ahead.
So this is Sam, and I'm going to jump in and with a question. So essentially, so I was wondering if you could explain a little bit about the relationship of scheduled demand and then bid-in demand and the load forecast. So Or am I jumping ahead to incorporate the load forecast into this kind of process here?
Well, we'll talk about the load forecast next.
Okay.
But it's a good point to make, and I tried to make that on the earlier slide, that when we talk about self-schedules for demand or economic bids for demand, that is not based on the ISO forecast of what the demand will be for the coming day. That is probably based on the load serving entities' forecast of their own demand and determining how much they want to bid into day ahead. Day ahead is the only opportunity for these load serving entities to bid in their demand and to associate an economic bid with those megawatts. In other words, the day ahead market is their only opportunity to say, I'm willing to purchase X number of megawatts if the price is such and such. In real time, we clear supply based on the forecast, not based on any economic signals from load serving entities on the demand side. So it's a good point to reiterate that in the day ahead market, that is the only opportunity for load serving entities of demand to essentially provide the market with an economic signal that says, this is how much I'm willing to pay. And if I'm able to secure X number of megawatts in day ahead, that's wonderful. The reality is that in real time, if I, as a load serving entity, consume more than those megawatts, then I will be paying for those megawatts at whatever that real-time price ends up being. And again, I don't have the ability to provide an economic signal in real time to tell you what I'm willing to pay. Does that help tee up the question or the conversation?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, good. So any other questions about IFM before we start talking about how we do incorporate the forecast in the next process?
We do have a question in queue. Alex Spain is in queue. Alex, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Rada, a question for you. In co-optimizing the energy and the ancillary services, if I have a resource, let's say it's got a 100 megawatt capacity resource, can I bid into those three markets collectively with the assurity that I'm not going to get awarded in all three and essentially have an infeasible solution that's above the capacity of my resource? So I see you nodding your head. Is that co-optimization in the awards driven by your economic bid, or is it driven by something that may be behind the scenes in terms of what the capacity is registered for your resource in the ISO?
Yeah, great question. And I've got an example at the end that highlights this for you. So it's a nice way to tee that up. And you'll also be able to visually see kind of the answer to what we're talking about in a couple of slides from here. But I will answer it now. Yes, you're going to be bidding if you want to, the full capacity of that resource into all of the different market products. And that co-optimization that the market engine will do will determine the best economic way to use this resource, and it will award the resource appropriately, meaning if you have a 100 megawatt resource and you've bid in for energy and for ancillary services, you will not get awarded for 100 megawatts in both products because you don't have 200 megawatts to begin with. So the market will figure out and adjust the awards based on what it knows of your resource, again, like you said, based on the characteristics that we have of that resource in our master file. I think you said that, or maybe I'm just so familiar with the term that I popped it in there into your sentence. But yes, we'll make sure that we don't award you over and above your resource's capacity, and we will know what that resource's capacity is, and you'll be awarded accordingly in the market run based on either economics, or maybe there's a transmission constraint that requires one resource to be selected over another, but it's a combination of the security constrained part of the calculation along with the economic bids that you've submitted that is the concept of co-optimization, in that energy and ancillary services are being optimized together. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think it does. I think you're assured that you're not awarded above what the capacity is registered in the master file. So that's your headroom is identified by the master file, not by what you bid into the market. So that clarifies that. Thank you.
Yep, absolutely. All right, did we have any other questions?
Yes, we do have an additional question in queue.
Okay.
Lauren, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead. Lauren, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead. Lauren, be sure to unmute your audio on WebEx because you are currently unmuted and we cannot hear you. All right, Lauren, we'll come back to you. You can chat me and let me know what issues you're having. Meanwhile, we're going to move to Ian. Ian, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Hi, Rada. Thanks for taking this. Ian White with Shell Energy. I was just wondering if you could kind of tease out some of the detail between the relationship between energy and or ancillary services dispatch in the day-ahead market.
Absolutely.
And sort of their co-optimization.
Yeah, so the market, so a resource will submit bids for energy and for any ancillary services that they are certified for. The market, as it solves for each hour, will determine the best way to use that resource. It may be for energy or ancillary services or a mix of both, depending on the situation and the calculation for that day. You will not be awarded more than you're able to provide based on the information that we have on your resource. Is there anything else that I wanted to add to that? I feel like there's something that you're looking for that I may not be providing. So is there
a prioritization in awards between energy and ancillary services? Like if you're bidding for both, does the market prioritize or when it's looking to do that optimization, does it try to fill one bucket before another?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Pam.
Okay, I see what you're saying. To be honest, I don't know the detail on that. I could hypothesize. I know we have 100 some odd people on the phone call here who may very well know the answer to this question. And if you do, feel free to put that in the chat. But if not, I can take that down and then provide an answer to Emily. I haven't dived into the calculation that deep, so I don't want to lead you down the wrong path here. So I'll just make a note. And what I'll do is pass notes after the call to Emily, and she'll be able to pass that back through the RIF process to you.
Thank you.
All right. We are going to now move back to Lauren.
Okay, thank
Lauren,
you.
Perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. Lauren Tenney Dennison, Public Power Council. Thanks for this overview. I just want to make sure I'm understanding. In the IFM, is it a single run that is resulting in both pricing, dispatch, the full co-optimization of both energy awards and ancillary service awards, or are there multiple runs needed through that process?
My understanding is that it's a single run, but I don't want to steer you wrong on that as well. I'm not sure if we do multiple passes. I'd have to, that's something that I would have to double check. I kind of think of it holistically from market power mitigation, IFM, RUC, and I'm not sure how many iterations that we do. So before I steer you wrong on that, let me just double check.
Okay, thank you.
All right. There are no additional questions in queue. I do see a question in the chat, though, from Mark.
Mark Richardson, I think that's the Mark with the ISO, who says it is a true co-optimization between ancillary services and energy based on the registered characteristics and economic signals. Thank you, Mark. I appreciate that clarification.
All right.
We have about 20 minutes left in our presentation. I think we should probably move to the last section, and then if there are additional questions on any of the other components of this presentation, we can definitely circle back to those as well.
All right, let's move forward then. So the third process is called residual unit commitment. And here is where we are essentially making sure that we are ready and available, or ready and have prepared enough resources to provide energy based on now what we've forecasted the demand to be for the coming days. So residual unit commitment is committing additional resources. It's a method of ensuring reliability of the grid. There are separate RUC offers that are submitted in addition to bids for energy and ancillary services. Whether or not you offer into RUC voluntarily or on a must offer obligation is determined by whether or not the resource has a resource adequacy contract. If you have a resource adequacy contract, right now we're talking just about the state of California, for RA, then you are required to bid into RUC in addition to energy and ancillary services. And any market awards for these resources are required that you submit a bid for energy in real time. And that's true for ancillary services and for RUC. And what we mean by that is, if you are awarded for energy, that's an energy award from day ahead. That is scheduled energy for the coming day. RUC or ancillary services that are awarded in day ahead mean that you need to bid those megawatts into real time as energy. So if I'm awarded for RUC and day ahead, I need to submit energy bids in real time for those megawatts. Just like with ancillary services, if I'm awarded ancillary services in the day ahead time frame, I need to bid those megawatts into real time as energy. So there is a requirement to do that from a RUC award. A couple other points related to RUC. We use the same optimization engine as we do the integrated forward market. The RUC process is set up to meet a high confidence demand forecast. So a certain percentage of that forecast, I don't know the exact percentage number, but we'll call it high confidence, as opposed to something called max confidence, which would be 100%. So we're not saying 100% of forecast, but a certain percentage of that. We remove any of the virtual supply or demand bids from the calculation. So in the day ahead market, there is this concept of financial participation, where you take a position in day ahead and it's liquidated in real time, but there is no physical resource associated with that. In the residual unit commitment process, we remove those types of bids from the calculation because we are looking at true energy supply that is available to meet the true physical energy demand. And we also introduce forecasts for variable energy resources into the calculation here in RUC. And what I mean by that is we have analyzed, or we have the ability to analyze the expected output of a variable energy resource and compare that expected output to how much that resource may be bidding into the market. And there could be a discrepancy there, which means that we could make an adjustment to this forecast, either on the supply side or the demand side, depending on what's required as part of this process. So those are a couple of points about RUC, and then I've got a visual that will take you through how that actually works. So the title of the slide is here, and it's indicating that we ensure that we have sufficient capacity available to meet forecast demand that was not committed in IFM. So in IFM, we have total clear demand, both physical and virtual bids are in the mix when we're doing that process. When we get to RUC, we remove the virtual transactions from the equation, and that may change or adjust how much demand had cleared for that particular interval. We then compare what did clear to the forecast for that particular hour, and we use the RUC process to bridge that gap. Essentially, because we are clearing the prior process, the integrated forward market, bid-in supply against bid-in demand with an economic signal, that means that we may not procure all of the capacity that we will need based on what we forecasted. So step 2 clears bid-in supply against bid-in demand and does it with an economic signal. Step 3 looks to make sure that we've procured enough supply to meet all of that demand forecasted for that particular hour. And we do that for all of the 24 hours of that particular trade date. We procure RUC in zones, and this image here is somewhat of a simplification of how that works, just to give you a high-level explanation. I've got another slide here that gets into a little bit more detail of how that works exactly. But essentially what we're saying is we have specific service territories that have a certain amount of demand, or that have certain demand forecasts for each of those hours. In addition, we have participating transmission owners that may have demand response programs that they can call upon to decrease the amount of energy that they're consuming in a particular hour. They have the ability to use that information as an input into the market for us to procure less residual unit commitment for their particular area. So that's a nuance there. The way we clear for RUC is we take the demand forecast for that particular trade date, and we essentially spread that across the full network model's connectivity nodes using methodology called system load distribution factors. So essentially take the load forecast for the coming day, spread it across the footprint, and determine where we may need to procure any additional capacity in any of these 24 hours. The RUC offers that I mentioned are bid in at a single quantity and price. And I do want to point out that if you happen to be a resource adequacy resource in the state of California, you are getting paid for your capacity through that RA contract, which means that when you are offering into this RUC capacity product, that your bids are treated at $0 for any of those megawatts that have been designated as resource adequacy capacity. I point that out in the context of this is how we're doing it right now for the state of California. Obviously, if this were to become a regional thing, there would be different rules that would apply, but this is how we're doing it here specifically for the state of California. How we clear for RUC, we first take a look at those resource adequacy resources that are either short start or had bid into the day ahead market but had not been fully awarded. So these RA contracts that we're talking about, they're already being paid for that capacity. So we'd like to use that free capacity first and see if we can clear RUC with that. If the market has the ability to clear all RUC megawatts from RA resources, then that RUC price will be $0. It's possible that it could go above that, but those RA resources are not going to be paid in RUC for their capacity for any of those megawatts that are under that RA contract. After we look at those short start resources, we look for long start resources that might already have been awarded in the integrated forward market process, meaning we already have that resource starting up and operating on the coming days. So could we perhaps procure additional capacity from that resource? And then finally, it takes a look at those RUC offers with a nuance or a flavor there that if the offer happens to be from a long start resource that did not get an award in that prior IFM process, then we need to take a look at their startup and minimum load costs to determine whether or not it's economic to start up that resource. And the reason behind that is because RUC awards in the day ahead timeframe are going to be binding for those long start resources. And this slide here will show you kind of wraps that up by saying that if I receive a RUC award, now I need to submit a bid into the real-time market to cover those awarded megawatts. If I'm a short start resource, that means that those RUC awards are advisory. I need to have those economic bids submitted, but I don't yet need to be on and running because it doesn't take me that long to start up. And so you would wait for that market instruction before actually starting that resource. If you're a long start resource, then those day ahead RUC awards are binding, meaning that you need to be on, running at your PMIN in real time with an economic bid curve for energy that supports those megawatts that you are awarded through RUC. And just a clarification here that when we are talking about long start resources, we're saying any resource that has a startup and min runtime greater than 4.5 hours. There's a question in the chat that asked if RUC bids from RA resources must be $0, how do they get paid if they're dispatched? That is a separate payment. So if you receive a RUC award in the day ahead and you are one of these RA resources, what we're saying is you don't get paid for that RA capacity that was bid into RUC, but you are required to submit that real-time energy bid into the real-time market. So if you are dispatched in real time, you get paid the real-time energy price for that energy. So you're definitely getting paid for the megawatts that you're generating, but you're not getting paid for capacity twice, once through your RA contract and then again through this RUC product. So hopefully that clarifies that for you there.
So would a RUC award, is it a characterization if you're an RA resource and you receive a RUC award, it's almost like a standby requirement?
I wouldn't say standby requirement. It's if you receive a RUC award, then you need to submit bids for energy into the real-time market. And depending on your resource characteristics, short start versus long start will determine whether you have to actually act upon that. So I'll go back to this slide. If you're a short start resource, it's advisory, meaning you don't have to do anything yet until in real time you might get that real time dispatch. But if you are a long start resource, then you're expected to be on and running with economic bids to support that. So it depends on the capabilities of the resource as to what you need to do. But either type of resource, if you get a RUC award, you need to submit a bid into the real-time market for energy. All right, I've got a couple more slides here, and I knew it was optimistic to think I could do 50 slides in an hour, but I will get through all of the day ahead. And then the real-time slides are there for you to take a look at. And again, we could revisit that perhaps at another time if you all would be interested in that. A little bit more about RUC is we don't just look out that trade date, but we also look out multiple trade dates because there are some situations where we have extremely long start resources that take greater than 18 hours to start up, or other situations where folks need to be notified at 0600 instead of 1300. So there's some nuance behind reasons why we look at RUC and we look out for multiple trade dates. Also, from an economic perspective, if we've got a resource that's on and running, we may want to see across a couple of days if it makes the most sense to keep them on. And so we'll do this RUC process so we can do a little bit of analysis there. These commitments are generated by RUC, and you'll either get manually notified or you'll get your market results in one of our reporting tools letting you know that you have awards for RUC. Now, this next slide here is kind of the wrap-up slide that I want to discuss that brings together the concept of co-optimization and also respecting your resource characteristics. So I've got an example here. This is a day-ahead supplier. I've got a PMIN of 50 and a PMAX of 140. And in this example, I'm saying this resource is submitting a self-schedule of 70 megawatts. So they're saying, I'm going to be generating 70 megawatts in this particular trade hour. I'm also layering on top of that an additional 70 megawatts of economic bids for energy. That might have a specific bid curve with a certain dollar amount associated with a series of steps in that bid curve, but offering an additional 70 megawatts of energy. Along with that, this resource is also certified for spinning reserves, and so they are offering 40 megawatts into the spin product of ancillary services. Now, if you added all of these megawatts together, 70, 70, and 40, that's over and above the Pmax of that resource. So the market already knows the characteristics and capabilities of the resource, and when the market is awarding this resource during that co-optimization process, it will figure out the best way to use this resource. So these are essentially the same megawatts being offered to the market across a variety of products, and the co-optimization takes a look at the offers from your resource along with everybody else's to figure out the optimal solution across the entire day. After the market has cleared and provided awards for energy and ancillary services, the RUC process, which comes next, takes a look at the RUC offers. And if there are any megawatts left over on this resource to be filled by this RUC offer, then that resource is analyzed for RUC. But if all of the megawatts had already been used up through energy or ancillary services or a combination of the two, then the RUC offer is no longer available. And so that's kind of how you're offering at the same time into all three of the different products, but you may be awarded differently based on the market solution. So with that, the last slide I guess we'll go to is the question slide, but I'll leave it here for a visual that kind of ties it all together. I think I have 3 minutes left for questions, so we'll take some of those now.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, as a reminder, you can press the raise hand icon that is directly above the chat panel on the right to enter the question queue, or you can press #2 on your telephone keypad to enter the question queue.
So there's a question in the chat from Stephen that says, so getting awarded in any market before the real-time market, those awards are only capacity awards. Real-time is the only market that pays for energy. Question.
If we're talking about the ancillary services, so the day-ahead energy awards come with a payment for that day-ahead energy award. So you're awarded X number of megawatts in day-ahead, and you're paid in the day-ahead settlements process for those megawatts. Now, obviously, then you'll need to provide those megawatts in real time, or if not, there will be real-time settlements that will compare your meter data to your award, and if you didn't provide that energy, obviously you'd pay that back during the real-time settlements process at the real-time price. But essentially, the day-ahead market provides you with a schedule for the coming day for energy and an obligation to submit bids for any of the ancillary services or RUC offers as additional megawatts for energy in real time. Does that answer your question?
So I think my question was similar as well, which is, or is related, because I was thinking about it from a slightly different lens, which is, so if you are cleared in the bid-in supply and demand day-ahead market, that middle process that we were talking about, you get settled and paid according to the LMP in the day-ahead market. But because that market includes virtual supply and virtual demand, there's this separate RUC process that clears, but includes a physical obligation for resources without a payment. And am I thinking about this right, that there's no separate payment through RUC because first there's a capacity obligation to bid into the market, and so the capacity component is settled outside of these two markets, but also because if you were a resource owner with an RA award, you could essentially put in a virtual supply or a virtual demand award that would force an additional RUC award and then get paid maybe twice for both your virtual and your physical RUC award. That was probably a very complicated question.
So there were a lot of thoughts there. Let me see if I can capture all of them. First of all, I want to clarify a couple of things. There is an energy payment for your energy awards in day ahead. There are also ancillary services awards payments at different ancillary services marginal prices. So the 4 different ancillary services, regulation up and down, spin and non-spin, all have prices associated with them in the day ahead. So you get a energy payment in day ahead, and you also get a capacity payment for any of those ancillary services products that you were awarded. So energy and capacity payments. Now RUC, when we talked about this concept of no payment for RUC capacity, that is only if you are a resource adequacy resource. And the reason why you don't get a RUC payment for those RA megawatts is because you're already getting paid for those RA megawatts through your capacity contract with the load serving entity. So the supplier is not going to be paid for capacity by the load serving entity and by the market, so twice before they've even provided it, if that makes sense. So if you are a regular resource that doesn't have a resource adequacy contract and you submit a RUC offer and get awarded, you'll receive whatever that RUC amount ended up being. So it's only these RA resources that, remember, are already getting paid for that capacity that don't get a second RUC capacity payment for those same megawatts. So yes, you're paid for energy in day ahead. Yes, you're paid for ancillary services capacity in day ahead. And yes, you may or may not be paid for RUC depending on the type of resource you are and whether or not you have an RA contract. Now in real time, your bids, or I should say your awards that you received for capacity and day ahead for ancillary services and for RUC, you bid into real time as energy, and then if dispatched, receive that real time energy price. So you're always paid for the energy that you are producing. The LMP that is used is determined by when you were whether you were awarded in day ahead or in real time, or honestly a combination of the two. I could get a day ahead award and then I could get more awards in real time, and I could be paid some megawatts at the day ahead price and some megawatts at the real time price. So it's kind of all of that put together. And I think that touched on all of the points that you brought up. And if there was something that's still lingering, let me know.
Okay. Well, I asked, I think, a complicated question that ran us out of time. So I think your information has been shared if folks have additional questions to follow up with you directly. And thank you so much for this presentation. I think clearly from the questions that were asked that there's a lot of new information, and I think very helpful to lay out just the current construct for the day ahead and the different components, so that we, especially as we explore EDAM, we can really understand what the timing of these processes are and how they're really laid out. So thank you for bringing this to us today.
Yeah, sure thing. If I could say one more thing, I know that I had a bunch of other slides. If any of you who are listening in had questions or want to talk about the real time, there is a contact email at the end of that presentation, and you could email your questions to customerreadiness@CAISO.com, and we can help you with those. So with that, I'll close it, and I'll turn it back over to you, Pam. Thank you.
And I would say that in a similar way, in that I would ask our stakeholders here today that if they want to see this similar presentation for the real time, to look through those other slides and to reach out to your liaison to share whether that's something that you would want us to bring back to this forum. So we'd appreciate your input on continuing this conversation to review the real-time slides as well. Again, thank you, Radha. That was excellent, and I think very clearly presented, and a lot of information there. But with that, I think we are over time to turn it to our last agenda item today, which is a new entrant presentation from the Western Area Power Administration. John Paulson is joining us, and I will ask our host, have you located John and promoted him to the speaker group? There's John. So
hello.
A little bit a little bit of context here. The new entrant presentations are a long-standing RIF tradition that dates back to the very early days of this forum. And it's been a really great opportunity for all of us to meet new entrants into this market and to really get an understanding of who was joining the market, what resources they're bringing, and what really was driving that decision making. And so I'll turn it over to you, John, to walk us through this presentation.
Yes, and I would like you to advance the slides for me. Thank you. I just got that question from chat. If you wouldn't mind moving to the next slide, please. Thank you, Pam. I'm John Paulson with WAPA here in Phoenix, the Desert Southwest region. And I plan today to give you an introduction to WAPA, some discussion on how WAPA has fallen out so far in market participation, kind of WAPA, the different WAPA regions, how the Desert Southwest region came to decide on EIM participation, and then some discussion on our implementation projects so far. Next slide, please. So WAPA is Western Area Power Administration. We are considered one entity, but we also have a very decentralized structure. And I'll get to that in a minute. Next slide, please. So WAPA is one of the 4 power marketing administrations under the Department of Energy. Department of Energy was formed in the late 70s. WAPA was formed at that same time. Prior to that, a lot of the functions that WAPA currently provides were handled by either the Bureau of Reclamation or the Corps of Engineers. We are a wholesale electricity supplier. We have nearly 700 customers. Typically, those customers are what we call preference customers, co-ops, towns, government agencies, and other usually public utility type entities. And those customers in turn serve 40 million Americans in the West. Next slide, please. So as part of our service territory, we are basically balancing this distributed and broad system. We have 4 regions and 1 management center. We have a 15-state footprint, and we are one of the top 10 largest transmission utilities in the country. Next slide, please. So one of the big reasons behind our decentralized structure is the distinct hydro projects that we support. Each regional office was set up more or less around those projects. And each one of those projects has distinct marketing plans and contracts. We can think in terms of our Upper Great Plains region, which markets dam projects along the Missouri River, and our Sierra Nevada region, which is in near Sacramento. That is the Central Valley project. So different regions are typically associated with those different projects, and they all have kind of their own organic history and how they came to be, part of the infrastructure that they serve. Now, the Desert Southwest region here in Phoenix is where I work, and it's also where the Western Area Lower Colorado Balancing Authority is operated from. WALC is the entity that's joining EIM, and this is not a picture of the WALC BA, but it's a picture of the Desert Southwest region service territory, more or less. We're kind of that unattractive green color in the corner there, and you can see that Phoenix is our regional office. Projects that we manage and we market from the Desert Southwest region include the Parker and Davis dams, and they are also associated with the Parker Davis Transmission Project. Parker has installed capacity of 120 megawatts. of which half is allocated directly to Metropolitan Water District of Southern California, and then the rest is marketed to Parker Davis customers. Davis Dam has an installed capacity of 255 megawatts, and its full output is allocated to those Parker Davis customers. Hoover Dam, or the Boulder Canyon project as it's referred to on this picture, has an installed capacity of 2,074 megawatts, but the current rated capacity is reduced, obviously, by the very low Lake Mead elevation. Right now, that's only we only have 1,477 megawatts of capacity at Hoover. So, as no doubt all of you have probably seen on the news, we've got a huge drought that we're dealing with, and Lake Mead's low elevation is part of that drought that continues. Also, we have the Pacific Northwest, Pacific Southwest Intertie, which is a transmission-only project that connects the Phoenix area with Southern Nevada. There's a WAPA substation near Hoover Dam called Mead, and there's a 500 kV line that is operated from Phoenix up to Mead, connects at West Wing and other points. I know we have lots of customers in California that utilize that capacity to take some of their Palo Verde generation home and other usage of that transmission project. The other project that we operate is the Central Arizona Project transmission, and that's another transmission-only project that connects pumping load with power generation to keep Colorado River water flowing throughout the state of Arizona. The Central Arizona Water Conservation District has pumping throughout the state of Arizona and a system of canals, and they retrieve Colorado River water from Lake Havasu, which is the reservoir that backs up to Parker Dam. That is pretty much a description of all the regions. Next slide, please. So our role in providing energy, we're very pleased to be marketing clean hydropower to those preference customers that I just told you about. We also have balancing authorities that control part of the energy grid. There's the Western Area Lower Colorado Balancing Authority. There's a balancing authority just to our north called the Western Area Colorado Missouri Balancing Authority. And then there's different aspects of the transmission system that WAPA operates in other regions, including in some of the eastern interconnection and then some of the Sierra Nevada region area in Northern California. And we are also a transmission provider and managing the interties that are part of our system. Next slide, please. So we have obviously firm electric service that is being marketed from our hydropower projects. We have energy management marketing. We provide, in my office, we provide scheduling coordinator services to some of our preference customers. We do energy and resource planning associated with some customers' full load requirements as they come to us and request that service. Obviously, we're a very big transmission provider. We also support interconnections to independent power producers who may want to utilize WAPA transmission in order to take their power to markets in different regions. And we also do have the capability to support ancillary requirements with our hydro resources as well. Next slide, please. Just kind of a fact sheet of what we manage. Obviously, there's a lot of assets, a lot of structures. This is, WAPA wide. We're not talking in terms of just the Desert Southwest region. As we said, we're fairly extensive transmission, have a fairly extensive transmission system in the Walk BA. We probably have more transmission business per se than we do actually generation business. So that's a huge part of WAPA's overall mission and assets that we manage, and it is also a huge part of the Desert Southwest region and the Walk Balancing Authority. Next slide, please. So WAPA's position on markets, this is really prompted by the fact that we do have sort of a different set of market participants in the different regions. Our upper Great Plains region, which is the UGP area up at the top, they have some of their system in the Eastern Interconnection, and their system is part of the Southwest Power Pool RTO. The UGP also has a western portion of their system that is a balancing authority in the Western Interconnect, and they are in the Weiss energy imbalance market currently, and they're also considering this potential for a new SPP RTO. The Rocky Mountain region, or RM on the map here, they're also participating in the Weiss, as is the CRISP CRSP area, also participating in Weiss and looking at the potential of that new SPP RTO. In Sierra Nevada, that area has joined EIM as of last year, and they are operating as a PRSC. They're part of the bank implementation, with bank being the EIM entity in that area. So you can see that with DSW now making the decision to move towards EIM, we do have somewhat of a different approach among those different regions. And a lot of that's based on where those regions are located, their customer base, and the transmission connections that are associated with those different systems. Next slide, please. So when the Weiss project was formed, we had a group of customers in the DSW region that came to us and suggested that we do a study that would compare the benefits and the costs associated with WAPA, DSW, or WALC joining either the Weiss or the EIM. That study included a benefits component that we worked with E3 on, and a gap assessment that we worked with Utilicast on. And the results of kind of both sides of those studies was that EIM was probably a better fit in terms of the liquidity of the market and our transmission connections. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but where we sit, obviously we are in a better position connection-wise with EIM utilities. Our connection with the BACM, or the Rocky Mountain Balancing Authority, was really not as robust as it probably needed to be to support a lot of market activity. So we held a customer meeting in June of last year, where we gave our customer and stakeholder group the notice that we had, we were recommending that WALC move towards EIM. We got a lot of good customer support on that recommendation, and so we moved forward with a kind of a decision framework and a project charter associated with implementation. And we were able to work with the Cal ISO on finalizing an implementation agreement in September of last year, and we made the announcement that we were moving forward with implementation, and we're currently scheduled for April 5th of 2023. Next slide, please. So our ability to function in the market, we're exclusively a hydro system, and so there's some constraints on our hydro and our ability to operate in the market. We do project some benefits from that E3 study, but most of all, what we're experiencing is a kind of a lack of liquidity in the bilateral market and a continuing difficulty in being able to operate, especially in real time, and the inefficiencies of a kind of an illiquid and very kind of, well, just not flexible real-time market based on, the proliferation of market activity amongst our neighbors and counterparties has really kind of made it very, very difficult for us to operate in the status quo. So we're looking forward to, participating in the market, and we're looking forward also to the benefits that we hope will accrue with the greater certainty of that market to be able to provide us with that real time within our dispatch. Next slide, please. So just some thoughts about what we've been facing so far with our implementation work. We kicked off our implementation project, last summer. We've made a lot of progress moving towards our April 5th, 2023 implementation date. And we're working through some challenges here. So the first one is, we have several connections with current EIM entities. We've got 5 other current or soon to be EIM entities: Arizona Public Service, Salt River Project, NV Energy, and Los Angeles Department of Water and Power, and then Tucson, who plans to join early next year, or I guess in a couple months at this point. And then we also have some direct connections with the Cal ISO. What we've learned is that since we're the last to come in, we get to manage a lot of those ETSRs associated with those connections. So we're working with all of those entities on the setup for those ETSRs. It's been a good collaborative process with all of them, and we're hoping to get a lot of that kind of resolved here within the next month or so. Also, as far as hydro constraints, managing the competing interests associated with hydro generation, it's a challenge. There's usually a kind of a preference for water deliveries, and maybe sometimes even like recreation on a reservoir over the optimal dispatch of a hydro unit. And the needs of water usually outweigh the needs of power. But we have a really good relationship with the Bureau of Reclamation, who operates the dams that we manage, and we're hoping to be able to leverage as much as we possibly can the market, the potential for market benefits on those resources. So that's an ongoing process that we're working through. APCO subentity. So Arizona Electric Power Cooperative, they're a very significant generation and transmission supplier in the WALC footprint. And we've really been joined at the hip with those folks throughout our study and early implementation efforts. They're a very large part of the WALC Balancing Authority. And when we announced our entrance into EIM, they were right there with us as part of that announcement. So APCO has determined that acting as a sub-entity scheduling coordinator is in their interests, and WAPA is in support of that effort. We are beginning to start a kind of a 3-way coordination between Cal ISO, APCO, and WAPA to make this new entity construct successful. And so as far as we know, APCO is the first one who's kind of out of the gate trying to utilize this new scheduling coordinator function. And so there'll be a lot of interesting work and collaboration coordination on the way to implementation for that. Also, as I mentioned, the hydro coordination, Hoover Dam, which is a very large and important hydro resource in the Southwest. We have several customers who utilize their allocated output of the dam for ancillaries through the use of a dynamic signal. Hoover has a very flexible generation dispatch available, and we were able to offer that that dynamic signal to customers that can make use of it. Currently, those customers are using that dynamic signal through a dynamic schedule. And what we're learning is that the transfer of dynamic schedules in the EIM framework can become somewhat of a difficult prospect if there's settlements associated with those dynamic changes. And so we are working with all of those dynamic customers, and there's currently 7, soon to be 8, to transition to pseudo ties instead. And we've begun discussions separately with the 3 EIM entity BAs who currently use dynamic scheduling. And we've also begun discussions with the 5 other customers who take their Hoover allocations dynamically into the Cal ISO. Cal ISO is helping with that coordination, and we actually had a very productive first meeting for that effort earlier this afternoon. We're also working with other independent generators in the Wallach Balancing Authority. We've contacted them to determine their market plans, and so far, most have signaled that they plan to be non-participating, but we haven't really gotten all of them to commit one way or another. So that effort is still ongoing. And then finally, I'm sure all of your organizations have gone through similar pain around trying to find the resources to make this very large implementation effort possible, with current staffing and other resource constraints, and we're no different than in that regard. So we have contracted with Utilicast, and we've also supplemented our current staff with some other contracted support so that we can work our way through all the requirements and all the changes that need to be covered in order to make that that implementation date. But we have no doubt that we'll have to continue working and finding the resources and making sure that we're able to meet our commitments and provide our deliverables. And that's pretty much all I had. If you want to move it to the next slide, I'm willing to take any questions that anybody might have.
All right. I do not see any questions in queue at this time.
I have one question, and I was going to ask if your experience with going live with the Bank Balancing Authority influenced your decision to add the other regions at all, or if it gave you any lessons learned that will help you in this process.
We've been working very closely with our colleagues up in the Sierra Nevada region who went through that transition. There's some differences in their implementation. They went in just as a participating resource scheduling coordinator, and we're going in as both EIM entity and participating resource. So we have obviously good contacts and good relationships with those folks. But as far as whether or not their experience influenced our decision, I think mostly our decision was based on just that comparison that we did between EIM and WISE, and how EIM just seemed like, the better fit in terms of its liquidity and the transmission connections that we currently have.
Thank you. Are there other questions in the queue?
There is one question that popped into the queue. Alex, your line is unmuted. You may go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. This is Alex Svane with BPA, so a fellow Power Marketing Administration fellow chatting with you here, John. 2 questions for you. One was that you said that your net benefits was $250,000 a year, and I was wondering on a margin basis, what were your gross costs, what were your gross expenses? I presume that's public information, but was that a pretty razor-thin margin of net benefits relative to the gross revenue and expenses associated with this endeavor and your operations?
It's a very narrow margin, Alex. But as I mentioned before, we have APCO and other entities in the BA that are moving forward with this transition as well. And the the actual study benefits as it accrued to kind of the rest of the BA looked a little better than our portion. So as a BA in total, it was more like I can't remember the exact number. I feel like it was somewhere between 1 and 2 million per year in benefits. So the portion that's attributable to WAPA distinctly was a little bit less, but at the BA as a whole, it was a little more. And if you think in terms of the costs versus the benefits, yeah, it's pretty razor thin if you look at it from a WAPA perspective. It's a little better when you look at it from a combined BA perspective.
Okay, thank you. And then one more question for you with regard to market liquidity. I mean, up in the Pacific Northwest, similarly, I mean, we're poised to join the EIM, and we've been surrounded by EIM, a growing number of EIM participating entities in the Northwest, but we haven't necessarily seen the drop in liquidity. Could you expand a little bit more about what is it you're seeing, and do you think that is attributed to other lower cost dispatch associated with transmission? Is transmission cheaper if you're dispatching and getting dispatched in the EIM relative to the bilateral market there in the desert Southwest? I was hoping you could shed a little more light into the discussions as to what's driving that cost. I presume it's a cost or net benefit equation that is, irrespective of bilateral phone calls we're getting in the real-time market. They're saying, no, I prefer to bid this resource into the market as opposed to, scheduling and transacting bilaterally.
So, that's a huge subject. I'm not as familiar with the Pacific Northwest, customer base or counterparty list, but I can tell you that in the Southwest, the number of counterparties that we have available to trade with have dropped. I think a lot of the merchant entities maybe have reduced their bilateral positions in our area, but we're still usually able to do the transactions that we need to do in the day ahead. It's when we get into real time where we have a real drop off in the liquidity and a real problem with the structural requirements of market participation and trying to basically purchase timely hourly energy. So a lot of times we're forced to make those trades in a more, I guess, inefficient way. In other words, we're having to purchase a lot of what we maybe would have done previously in real time in day ahead because we're not sure we're going to, one, have a counterparty that's available to trade with, and two, be able to manage our position in real time in such a way that we will have that availability because of the timing constraints. So those are kind of the big picture liquidity problems that we've been dealing with. But there are even days when, day ahead is an issue. And that's usually days where we're having some extreme weather events or, other disruptions. So, heat, fire, things like that. When those situations come up, we're even facing illiquidity in the day ahead. Whereas, most normal days, we still have, at least a few or, half a dozen or so counterparties that we can choose from to trade with on the day ahead. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, yes. Thank you, John.
All right. I do not see any additional questions in queue at this time.
Well, John, I want to congratulate you on your decision to join the Energy Imbalance Market, and thank you very much for your presentation today. It's clear that WAPA has a lot of different elements in a very complex operating environment to work through. So we're looking forward to hearing how that goes and getting some progress updates as you move through your implementation project. And if there are no more questions, I do want to extend my thanks again to all of the panelists we've had today and all of the liaisons for helping to coordinate and organize such a robust set of topics and diverse panels that we've had today. As always, we're open to new topics and ideas, so please reach out to your liaisons, and hopefully you're enjoying as bright and sunny day as we're having here in Portland. And with that, look forward to speaking with you all on the next Regional Issues Forum.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using event services. You may now disconnect.